Hi everybody, welcome to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 30th, where I wanted to continue our conversation about women in the 1800s and then move forward to our first major text, which happens to be Frankenstein. So if you look at the notes below, you'll see that those notes are based on this particular week. And you can access the previous weeks in one of the top folders of our Moodle section. It'll be entitled Past Discussion or Past Weeks folder, so that you will be able to find all of our previous week's information if you wanted to, but the actual week that we are discussing is what will be visible on your Moodle site. And the notes below serve as a kind of summary of what it is that I am talking about in these videos, but you should watch these videos in their entirety. That's ultimately how you can do best in terms of acquiring the information necessary for this class. And that said, we have some upcoming assignments, and what would be ideal, though I understand that the ideal is oftentimes different than the reality. The ideal is that you've actually finished reading Frankenstein, our first major text, in its entirety. So as we talk about it this week, what you are doing is reading our next major text, which happens to be Persuasion, and you would continue along that way. And what would be ideal is that at the ending of this week, you would be able to submit in your first journal on Frankenstein, our first major text. Though certainly you can reference some of the other texts that we talked about last class. For instance, The Cult of True Womanhood. And the idea behind the journal is that you would be writing a page or so. You can write as long as you like, but I'm thinking someplace in the ballpark of a page of your thoughts and your reflections, perhaps your questions on your ideas about the novel Frankenstein. And certainly you can incorporate some of what I've discussed in the class videos and some of what was discussed in the class discussion forum topics. So as you can see, I've responded to your responses in the class discussion forum. You're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are encouraged to do so, much like if you were in a live class and you felt moved to raise your hand to contribute to someone's commentary. That said, I do expect you to read everyone's comments and my comments in response, so that would give you a sense of what we would have discussed during a class discussion. So the last discussion question was about Story of an Hour and Joy That Kills and that ironic ending. And I see the Story of an Hour as still part of our introduction, that the class actually begins with Frankenstein. That said, there isn't any reason why you couldn't reference the Story of an Hour in a journal. As I had indicated, though, the first journal will be devoted to Frankenstein. And I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. It's as if we're having a conversation on paper. And I'm grading it informally on a checkmark system, so that you would submit that in to me, and then I would put some commentary on it and submit that back to you as if we were having a conversation on paper. What would be ideal is if you could hand in that first journal on Thursday, the 1st of June, by 11:59 p.m. to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best. That said, if you needed additional time with the journal, just ask, and that would be fine by me. But keep in mind, there isn't a whole lot of additional time in a summer session, because next week we begin with discussing Persuasion. Though my suspicion is that we'll probably need a little bit of next week to put some closure onto Frankenstein before we move forward into Persuasion. And you can see that information about the journals is in the second section in the notes below. And I've also included in our syllabus and other documents folder suggested paper topics, which I will be talking about in greater depth next class. And if you were to look at those suggested paper topics now, you'll see that these are just very broad ideas. Ultimately, the thesis or the specific argument that you're going to make is something that you need to develop on your own. And my thinking is that your first paper would be about either Frankenstein or about Persuasion. That said, you can perhaps write about the story of an hour. Just understand that's a very different kind of text as a short story compared to what we would find with a novel. So, in terms of thinking about where we are with female in the 1800s, so this would be the first section of the notes. You'll see that I have several links that I wanted you to look at. These would be handouts that I would be distributing if we were in a live class. The first link is a booklet, and it's entitled, Is College Bad for Girls? It was actually a 1906 medical pamphlet arguing that college is bad for girls. And I happened to find this in an antique store in New Jersey, and I knew as soon as I saw it that I had to purchase it. So it's hanging in the wall of my office. But since you can't come to my office if you are an online student, I wanted to at least give you a picture. And you, as I'm fond of saying, you can't make this stuff up. This piece talks a little bit about the dangers associated with education. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about incidents in the life of a slave girl and why it was considered so threatening that slaves would learn how to read. But some of the articles in Is College Bad for Girls include the evils of dormitory life, midnight hours of who knows what, forming unladylike habits that may harm the health and morals of a delicate girl, such as smoking and card playing, and reading improper novels, magazines, and other suggestive literature. In other words, what we're going to be doing this semester is reading novels, magazines, and other suggestive literature that could be considered improper, certainly might have been considered improper during this time period, especially after we established in the Cult of True Womanhood what life should be like for a female. And another link that I wanted to draw your attention to is the foreword in a book that was published in 1887 entitled The American Girl's Handybook. Now, this was a book that talked about arts and crafts that girls could participate in. And there was a reprint done in 1987. And in the foreword of the reprint, and unfortunately the link I have does not have the book in its entirety. I'm sure it has something to do with copyright. But I thought I would read you part of the foreword. And if it turns out that I, or perhaps one of you, can find this foreword online, then I can share that with you. But at the very least, I can read pieces of the foreword. If girls in Victorian America were confused, who could blame them? From every quarter they heard conflicting voices, each articulating its own version of what girls needed. One voice belonged to Dr. Edward Clark, retired member of the Harvard University Medical Faculty and author of the 1873 book, Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. Fair chances notwithstanding, Dr. Clark enlisted his medical training to denounce the burgeoning phenomenon of advanced education for adolescent girls. Whether at teacher training institutions, women's colleges, or co-ed state universities, Clark warned, girls were in grave danger of both physical and mental ruin. The reason? The female body, with its limited available energy, could not successfully meet the physical demands of puberty while also enduring the mental strain of study. Something would have to give, and what generally gave were the reproductive organs. Citing case studies of Vassar women, Clark sought to provide scientific evidence that too much study, and certainly any attempt to match any male educational achievements, would sap the developing female organs, leaving girls weak, nervous, and sterile. A frightening prospect for what girl wanted to end up like 18-year-old Miss D, who emerged from 4 years at Vassar, a hysterical invalid, her breasts and reproductive organs withered from excessive study and physical exercise. So, Dr. Clark prescribed large quantities of rest for growing girls. But there were others that suggested that girls were too idle, too confined. And dress reformers would be one of those. You'll remember that we talked a little bit about dress reformers in the Cult of True Womanhood. And in reference to dress reformers, they routinely denounced the restrictive clothing worn by fashionable Victorian women and their imitative daughter. Laced into tight corsets, carrying some 15 pounds of material from their cinched waists, these girls seemed unable to breathe, let alone engage in any strenuous physical or mental activity. And if girls were anemic and subject to fashionable fits of fainting, or afflicted with anorexic-like diseases, the reformers argued, what they needed was plenty of outdoor exercise, protein-rich diets, and new clothing styles that emphasized function over fashion. So this was the idea behind the American Girl's Handybook, which was considered somewhat revolutionary for its time, that a woman should be healthy and vigorous rather than weak and timid. And we will definitely see both versions of this female in the text that we will be reading over the course of the semester. And to continue on, you can see another link I wanted to draw your attention to was an article that appeared in Smithsonian Magazine about Darwin's Origin of Species and how it maintained that females were inferior because of their ability to reproduce. And in fact, I'll just read you a very short section here. In his theory of evolution, Darwin, like his predecessors, relegated women to a position subordinate to men because of their role in reproduction. A woman's worth was in her reproductive organs, and that women shouldn't become politically active or overly educated because that would ultimately endanger their reproductive abilities. And their natural role was basically to care for children as well as to bear them. The man's natural role to support and protect his family. And this similar sort of idea is something that we will see repeated over and over and over again. I encourage you to read the article from Smithsonian Magazine where there were questions about whether or not Darwin was accurate in his perceptions. Then a couple of resources that I wanted to draw your attention to. Now, I can't necessarily verify their original source, but I can verify that the spirit of the source is authentic. The first is a 1923 teacher's contract, and it's something that has been posted in lots of online sites. And again, while I can't necessarily verify this was an actual 1923 teacher's contract, it certainly does keep to the spirit of the belief of female role. And just to briefly read it to you, though you can access the link yourself, that these were some of the rules that a teacher had to agree to. Not to get married. The contract will become null and void upon marriage. Not to give company with men. To be at home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless in attendance at school functions. Not to loiter downtown in ice cream parlors. And I always like to joke in the summer that that's exactly what I'm going to do this summer, is I'm going to an ice cream parlor. Not to leave town anytime without the permission of the chairman of the board of trustees. Not to smoke cigarettes, drink beer, wine, or whiskey. Not to ride in a carriage or automobile with any man except brothers or father. Not to dress in bright clothes. Not to dye her hair. To wear at least 2 petticoats. Not to wear dresses more than 2 inches above the ankle. To keep the schoolroom clean. And not to use face powder, mascara, or paint the lips. Of course, now we're in the 20th century. Though as much as things change, they do remain the same. Do keep this in mind when we're reading something like Jane Eyre. So that'll be a little hint, because Jane Eyre will be talking a little bit about the role of governance and teacher. Another text that I wanted to draw your attention to, which again, I can't authenticate the original source, but the spirit of the source, definitely I can authenticate. The Good Wives Guide. That puts us into the 1950s. And this also is something that has been posted on many online sites, that this was an article that appeared in a woman's magazine with tips on how to be a good wife in 1955, including having dinner ready, preparing yourself for your husband's arrival, clearing away clutter, lighting a fire during the cooler months, minimizing all noise, greeting a husband with warm smile and sincerity. And notice, of course, the only possibility is heterosexual relationship in this list. To make sure that the husband talks first, that his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Not to greet one's husband with complaints or problems. Don't complain if the husband is late for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Make sure the husband is comfortable. Make sure to have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillows. Offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. That said, you can see that also in the notes below, I have an article from CNN. 5 things women couldn't do in the 1960s, which may or may not be a surprise to you that in the 60s, a woman couldn't have a credit card. Certainly not by herself. A woman couldn't serve on a jury. A woman couldn't buy a birth control pill. A woman couldn't get an Ivy League education. A woman wasn't legally protected in the workplace. And a woman couldn't openly talk about sex. So you can see we're getting closer and closer to contemporary times. There is a documentary that I highly recommend. It is 45 minutes, so I'm not requiring you to watch it. It came out in 2010, and it's entitled Killing Us Softly by Jean Kilbourne. You might know Jean Kilbourne. She's quite important as a media scholar. And what she has done over decades, basically, is analyzed advertisements and the portrayal of female in print advertising and also in video advertising. And what she found was probably not terribly surprising, except she began her groundbreaking work in the 1970s, and at that point it was surprising. And what she ended up doing was updating it each decade until she got to Killing Us Softly 4 in 2010. And what we see in Killing Us Softly 4 is that, yes, things have changed for the better, but as much as things change, they stay the same. And it really is a powerful examination about how female is objectified in popular culture, is sexualized and infantilized in popular culture, and how violence is encouraged against female in popular culture. It's one of the documentaries that I show in my medium popular culture class, actually. And while there isn't a Killing Us Softly 5 for the 2020s, there is a Killing Us Softly Then and Now panel discussion that was done by the Media Education Foundation, which supports Jean Kilbourne. That's 2 hours, and it came out in 2019, and you can see that I've included a link to that as well. I'm not requiring you to watch either one of these, but if you are interested, I can tell you they are fascinating in terms of seeing the way that we perpetuate stereotypes in our society. So, moving forward, where we are is talking about Frankenstein. So we've got a very unusual text written in 1818, written by a female. That in and of itself would have been unusual. Mary Shelley, who was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who you might have heard of, a very noted feminist. This piece has become iconic mostly because of 1930s Hollywood film, Universal Studios, by adapting the text into the popular culture figure of Frankenstein that we tend to think of with the square head and the bolts. And let me tell you, that was nothing like what Mary Shelley wrote. And I also teach a class in Gothic literature, so Frankenstein straddles a lot of different genres, Gothic, women in literature, also science fiction as well. And that said, one of the things that I think of in terms of Frankenstein is that the film, the iconic 1930s film, is an excellent film in and of itself, but it's a very different piece than what Mary Shelley wrote. I think of them as two separate texts. And Mary Shelley wrote this as part of a ghost story competition when she was vacationing with her husband, and there was some inclement weather, so they challenged themselves to a ghost story writing competition. And Mary Shelley had a dream, a nightmare actually, that night of the iconic creation scene, or what has become the iconic creation scene of the creature. Notice I never said monster, I said creature. And then what she ended up doing was writing a story around that. Her husband, Percy Shelley, you might have heard of, a great romantic poet, quite esteemed, read her story and suggested that she expand and develop sections, which she did, which has led to some controversy as to how much of this text is really Mary Shelley's if she was getting editorial assistance from her husband. I think that question in and of itself is interesting, because I don't think this question would be asked if the roles were reversed, if basically Frankenstein had been written by a male author and was getting editorial commentary from a female. We don't know, obviously, this is just speculation. But there are sections in the text where there are these long-winded descriptions of nature and the natural world that are thought that are mostly influenced by Percy Shelley as opposed to Mary Shelley. Again, Percy Shelley being the romantic poet, and of course the romantic poets known for their celebration of nature and the natural world. Though when we read Frankenstein, I'm going to talk about the importance of having the natural world within that text. Especially because even though a woman wrote this text, it's quite male-centric. All of the characters are male. And I wanted us to revisit that when we actually talk about the text itself. That said, what I thought we could do is watch that iconic Frankenstein from the 1930s. It occurred to me, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that while just about everybody in popular culture knows about that film, fewer and fewer of my students have actually seen that film. And I think it's worth watching so that we can just talk a little bit about how it was adapted. It's interesting how she's introduced in the credits of the film as Mrs. Percy Shelley. It almost reminds me of Mrs. Mallard in Story of an Hour. And Frankenstein is the name of the creator, not the creature. And notice that I'm not calling the creature a monster. The real monster is humanity, and how humanity abuses this creature, which you somewhat get a sense of in the 1930s film, but you definitely get a sense of in the novel. Again, the novel is very different in terms of its plot, in terms of its structure, even the character names. They've changed some of the names, and I'll give you some of my ideas as to why I think they changed some of the character names. Again, think of it as a separate text rather than a text that's going to be a reflection of Frankenstein itself. But since, again, in our popular culture, people are probably more familiar with the film than they are with the actual Mary Shelley text, I thought we could begin with the film, and also this would give you a little bit of time to catch up a bit with your reading if you haven't had an opportunity to finish the text yet. That 1931 film is an hour and 10 minutes. It was done by James Whale, and yet you can find it on all the primary streaming services like Amazon Prime and YouTube. You can view it for free, but with the soundtrack, because it originally was released without a soundtrack on Vimeo. And you can see in the notes below in section 4, I've included that Vimeo link for you. Or you can also watch it on Twitch TV without the soundtrack, but it won't be in high definition. So you can see that you've got lots of options here in terms of how to watch this particular film. And then next class we can begin to discuss the novel, which begins in many ways in quite a surprising manner. I've even had students tell me that they've wondered if they're reading the wrong book, because it begins with a series of letters from characters that Hollywood has not introduced us to. Walton, who's on a ship, journey, and he's writing to his sister, talking about his trials and tribulations. And the shipfaring journey is going to be important for us understanding what will occur in the plot later on. But again, Hollywood tended to want to simplify and shorten narrative. So again, don't necessarily expect that you are going to be able to see the film and understand the novel. Not at all. But even if the film were closely connected to the novel, watching a film is never a substitute for actually reading a text. There always are editorial decisions that are made in filmmaking that are decisions that probably wouldn't have been made by the author themselves. So that said, I thought that today's attendance question could be, after you've watched that 1931 film version of Frankenstein, did you like or dislike that 1931 film, and why? And you'll also notice that in the notes below in section 6, I've given you the link to Persuasion. And while we won't be working with Persuasion until next week, and of course all of the links are included in the course outline that I have submitted to you already. I wanted to reiterate that the sooner you begin reading text, the better off you are. So certainly, if you can begin reading Persuasion now. What we'll talk about next class is the construction of Frankenstein as a novel with letters. It's called an epistolary novel. It was a convention during Victorian times, and we'll talk a little bit about why Mary Shelley chose that mode of storytelling. We'll talk a little bit about the 1931 film and some of the changes it made to the novel and some of the reasons why it might have made some of those changes. And then we'll talk about, of course, some of the major themes within the novel itself, as well as I suggested earlier, those long nature passages and how they might serve as functions for storytelling. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about some specifics about the novel Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.